to determine how those often conflicting interests are reconciled, along with the resolution of conflicting interests from a wide spectrum of society. One of the ways this is most graphically illustrated is in relation to an area such as we have called World Squares for All. And that's really the story that I want to put before you today. These days to a plan of action. 3 years ago, a very slim document is produced by my department. That has a dozen proposals in it, some of which actually directly affect the area we're discussing today. 9 of those are currently being developed. This was a study carried out by Sir Michael Hopkins and a firm called Urban Initiatives for us. Stage 5, Section B of one of those projects now being developed is that thick. Has to be that thick as a publicly available document. This document, which involves World Squares, is the World Squares draft master plan, is in fact the same size as the entire development plan for the City of Westminster. It is of that degree of complexity and has to have that degree of coverage in order to justify even addressing the issue, let alone suggesting what one might want to do about it. So we go from a very small document to an incredibly large document, which 1,400 people have commented on. When it comes to trying to make a decision, and you'll be pleased I didn't attach these to the papers, otherwise you'd all been paying excess baggage on your trips home. The individual committee reports are 130 pages long. Because under the Local Government Access to Information Act, we must show, as you should do at exams, all your rough working. You must show all of your assumptions you have made, all of the policies, all of the issues you have considered, all of the responses put to you. When it comes to the public then being consulted, it boils down to an A5 leaflet. It's a graphic illustration of why many of us have very bad problems with our backs carrying these damn things around all the time. It also tells you something about the way the very important issue you're here to consider this weekend has to be addressed by public agencies. It is quite proper and reasonable for individual architects, individual designers, individual interest groups to raise whatever issues they like, how they like, to campaign, to argue, to evangelise even. But when it comes down to a public authority who sooner or later must either give consent or give funding, a process has to be established. One of the things I wish to concentrate on in the purposes of talking this morning is just the issues as a town planner, I would say this, wouldn't I? But issues that have been around for a long time, particularly since the 1960s, and which are resolved very neatly in the title of a book produced by a professor of sociology at the University of Kent, who's a leading figure in town planning in the 1970s, Roy Parle. And the title of his book was Whose City? ? This book is in itself a review of the influence of the great American sociologist and planner Herbert Gans, whose Peoples and Places is the best known version of his work in this country, where the profession of town planning, and for that matter city architecture or city planning, on both sides of the Atlantic was trying to address the legitimacy deficit, if you like, the gap in understanding between what professionals were suggesting for their public agencies and what the public were saying that they wanted. The battles of the 1960s between what was seen as superficially and inherently modernist approach to sweeping away the city and starting again. That, of course, was a false view, but nevertheless a view that was commonly held and illustrated in some sites, down to a view that was more responsive. And responsive to two things. It was responsive to people's views, and that is the people that spoke. There was no great plebiscite on these matters. The people that chose to express an opinion. Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities, the battles over Covent Garden in London, the community activist movements all over Europe and North America bore witness to various people becoming involved. But it also was a responsiveness to the environment. And the 1960s is a crucial period, not least because it's 30 years ago, and 30 years ago in Paris, life looked very different. 30 years ago in August, the Russians invaded Prague. Almost inconceivable now. As a 14-year-old at the time, it was exciting, I must say, and damned frightening at times when you heard it on the radio. But we have all come a long way since then. That doesn't mean the issues have changed that much, because frankly, they have not. The people that spoke loudest about city planning for most of its life as a public sector activity in the early part of this century were of an elite speaking to elite, and they didn't actually need to get very much involved in the public's view of these matters. Decisions about what was culturally important and how that important cultural heritage should be dealt with was certainly in London dealt with by very few people who all knew each other, probably from school days or university days on first name terms. Decisions about the size and siting of major office buildings in London in the 1950s were decided by very nice handwritten correspondence by one old boy suggesting to another old boy that they take a few more floors off New Zealand House and then it will be all right. I have the evidence on file. I am not making this up. If that was true in London, it was true everywhere else. We are not talking about things that are unique in London other than specific references. This is a basic human event about cities and people over this century. Therefore, in the 1960s, this annus mirabilis of 1968, which is more than appropriate to talk about today, and given what was going on in this building at the time, is important because at that time, most of what you will see tomorrow and most of what we now call world squares was to be swept away. It was to be demolished for government offices. Everyone had been to Brasilia, everyone that mattered, that is, of course, and had admired Niemeyer's work and thought, if you can do that in a rainforest, you can do that in central London. Well, yes, of course, you can, if you have boundless money and no constraints. If you want to know why Rasmussen's excellent revision of his own book, London's Unique City, the 1981 MIT revision, has such a sorrowful note, given that he first wrote it just before the war and then revisited it some years later. The sorrowful note is of the decisions made in the 50s and 60s to allow matters which he and many commentators has regarded as sacrosanct to be prejudiced for a number of economic motives. That's why you have tall hotels, the direct result of government subsidy to get dollars into the UK economy in the 1960s, and also not to put up a fight about any building older than 1714. I'm sure there is someone here from English Heritage. I hope they don't sue if I say this. But I, 25 years ago, was astonished to find out how buildings were listed of the Victorian era. There was a list of 25 principal architects who somebody considered to have been important. Now, I do know who those somebodies were, and I have an enormous amount of respect for their opinion. And today is not the venue to go in to discuss this again. But it was frankly bizarre, and not a view that subsequent scholarship has proven to be absolutely justified. 25 years ago, we were still understanding arts and crafts architecture. We were certainly still understanding the Greek revival. We were still finding the plans and the houses. The people who are taken for granted now as great iconic figures of the 19th century were still being discovered in leafy suburbs, in town centres, in their impact on government departments such as the Office of Works. Why is the Office of Works in this country so good between the wars? They're mostly Lutyens' pupils. We only just grasped that as the last of them died. Therefore, one of the things that has happened is the whole speeding up of conservation and what is heritage. In Westminster, as a local authority, we now have 11,000 listed buildings. That's 2.5 times the number of the city of Bath. Over 75% of the city is a conservation area where we protect buildings of architectural and historic interest. That's a significant, a huge number. It's more or less a third of all the buildings in Greater London that are listed. The boundaries of our concern are those of 19th century or 18th century parish churches. The boundaries of the City of Westminster are not a standard metropolitan statistical area. Every revision to them in the last 200 years has been political fudge and mudge, sometimes downright chicanery. I refer you to the 1958 Herbert Commission report on Greater London, the boundaries which have not been significantly changed since, and that report was a political fix by a former Conservative administration. As a result, London is managed in a certain way, not in relation to geography, in relation to history. The phrase, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it, particularly in relationship of London, is only all too evident. But the problem we faced in World Squares was this. What we had was a direct product of its history, and the living history. The government still own most of it. They control it by separate acts of Parliament. The government has created many quangos, agencies, non-governmental organisations and others, through which any proposal must be filtered. The steering group for World Squares is 33 organisations. Each one must tick the appropriate box at the appropriate time. Even with the changes to government departments, very welcome in recent last couple of years, 2 government departments whose interests are not necessarily coterminous have got to agree not only what is done, but who's going to pay for it and who is going to manage it. And therefore I want to return to the question of Roy Powell's book and say, let's look at the who's that matter, because this concerns certainly all of us from a European perspective. Slightly different in North America, I feel sure. But who commissions? Who is it who has the power publicly to turn around and say, I want to consider this issue? And there's a whole preamble to how you get to that point, of course. But who is going to say, this matters, I want to spend public money or get public authority to do this? How is that done? Without a proactive central government, without someone wanting to do it, most local authorities and public agencies will wait until it becomes a crisis. And we're back to the issue of who's talking about it, who's complaining, what are their terms of reference. In this country, despite recently having adopted a form of national curricula, the way people in this country have a chance to access and understand their own built environment is frankly nothing short of scandalous. It is hard work, and agencies are now beginning to address the issue, but you will not find, sadly, a well-informed public. For those of us involved over the years in education, particularly in adult education, you will find, however, an absolute ravenous desire for information. Pevsner's Building of England, it is often said, could only have been written in this country, certainly when it started in 1952, because there are so many people that are interested. Look in antiquarian bookshops, second-hand bookshops, the number of books that are written, some of them quirky, some of them quaint, but they're all written from the point of view of someone who is an enthusiast to other enthusiasts. The very existence of the campaigning side, as it were, of this organisation, and the contents of the Triangle Bookshop in the basement, I think, bear witness to the professional side of it. But for too long, the professions have pathetically ignored the interest of the average person. For too long, the Royal Institute of British Architects thought that the Open University teaching history of architecture and design was a joke. You go to the RIBA bookshop today and all the Open University set texts are there. Mainly because they're better than most books written by anyone else. They're certainly better illustrated. And I would say this because I'm a graduate of the Open University, but actually did involve some much more interesting scholarship than normally carried out and foisted either on the professional or the general public. So there's who commissions. There's then who designs. Well, in the old days, you could exercise patronage. You would turn to a commission. You would turn to the great and good. You would turn to someone who might actually be excellent. Well, you can do that today. Insofar as if you're a public agency in Europe, you will have to advertise in the office of the European Commission Journal. Boring document comes out each week. If the value is above £150,000 for a consultancy study, and then you will have to competitively assess the tenders you receive. That is why Sir Norman Foster and Halcrow Fox and Partners got the job. They were the best through open competition. Within London there's a huge debate as to which of our great architects, and we are fortunate to have several at the moment, should get the job, as if by right, as if by exercise of patronage. You've got to fill out a hell of a lot of forms, and we publicly must be seen to audit those forms and give value for money. Best price, best value, not necessarily lowest tender. That's something we at Westminster resolutely do not follow, although you're obliged to take it into consideration. There's then the important question for any public authority: who is consulted? All of this, frankly, has to make sense to probably the number of professionals in London who are in this room. Probably no more than that. We all have masters, and they all have voters. And we've got to find a way of making it make sense to them, or they're not going to vote for it. Particularly as anything you do in London with the physical realm must involve the displacement of traffic. And this tragically brings us back to Colin Buchanan's Traffic in Towns 1963. He wrote the book. It still doesn't need to be reprinted or revised. You can just take the pages out of the book. He posed the questions very, very boldly to society in 1963, along with such great writers as Ian Nairn, and the emerging information coming out of Pesner's Build of England, like its idiosyncrasies or not. For a large part of the time, successive governments were happy to ignore until it became overwhelming, the evidence being put to them. But now we're talking about a significant shift back in favour of the pedestrian. Although in saying that, the pedestrian's never been in favour. In 1762, the City of Westminster had to commission its own Acts of Parliament to control paving and lighting of streets, because the cartwheel ruts and the amount of horse dung and the lack of proper drainage was making the seat of government, of the royal family and the church untenable. You, however, must go back to the issue of who is being consulted and what weight do you give them. Remember, only residents have the vote. What about business? What about taxi drivers? Indeed, what about taxi drivers? How do you consult these people? Then the obvious question of who's going to decide. The steering group I referred to, the executive steering group of this study, is chaired quite properly by the Deputy Prime Minister, because his department is responsible for all things physical in the United Kingdom at the moment. A remarkable move which has aided and abetted the bringing back of environment and transport concerns under one roof. When we started this study, there were two separate ministries. There was a Department of Transport with one remit and a Department of the Environment with another. There was, to use a North American slang term, a turf war between those departments. There might still be, except that the environmentalists and the planners have won and the traffic engineers have been subsumed. Not before time. The final question we come back to, however, is who pays? The full implementation of what is likely to be the draft master plan, and we don't have it at the moment. We're looking at a working draft this week, in fact. This week just gone. Some large A3 sheets turned up from Foster and Partners and Co. You're looking at 50 million UK pounds over 5 years. And who pays brings us to another interesting issue, which perhaps only affects the UK in a certain way, but I think has wider applications. We got half the money for this study because of the existence of the National Lottery. We played the lottery and won. We've done it twice now. We are rebuilding what has been seen for 130 years as one of the biggest eyesores in London, which is the railway bridge across the Thames at Charing Cross, with £8 million of lottery money. And we decided to try with another lottery board, and we got half the funding for the original Foster study from the National Heritage Lottery Fund. Without it, we couldn't have justified, in the context of a local authority responsible for many areas other than the World Squares area, we could not have justified that money, because it's mostly government, and government put in far less money than we did. Because they had they didn't have a budget, they didn't have a policy objective that meant they had a budget or a cost code to justify it. I mean, I think they're getting there now. But a phenomenally difficult process has had to be gone through, hence the paper. And hence, regardless of how many ideas are new or old, or are seen as revisionist or modernist, you have to come back to the point about, is the society or its agencies actually equipped to deal with these questions? And frankly, only by the skin of our teeth would be the honest answer as to whether we are or not. The public agenda in this country, I think more widely in this country, is not yet set behind this degree of intervention or this degree of involvement, principally because it is a good idea to do it. It arises from individual pressure or individual smash and grab raids. It's worth pointing out, of course, that because of this, the study will always be the work of two parties. One is the excellent multidisciplinary team headed by Sir Norman Foster and partners and Halcrow Fox. The two are indivisible. If Foster's designed something and traffic and the highway people can't make it work, Foster's have got to redesign it. And the other way around. It is a joint team. And full credit must go to Spencer de Grey of Foster's and Dr Michelle Dix of Halcrow Fox for the phenomenal amount of work they've had and putting up with such a multi-headed client. But it then comes back to a room full of people pretty much like this, representing different agencies who have to try and justify that information back to their other controllers. And it's worth just ending on the fact that because of the political nature of the geography of London, which is still a thing of mystery and wonder and won't significantly change even if we end up with a mayor and a Greater London Authority, there are 6 local authorities. It's a bit like New York. There are 6 boroughs who are going to be very, very affected by whatever we do in our area. And they're going to be affected by traffic. So arguably without major shifts in public and political opinion about how the car is managed and controlled, and how access to town centres is managed and controlled, which the UK is amazingly bad at compared with best European practice. And what weight is given to public transport, short of writing about historic environments, we can do little to improve their setting or to improve their appearance and legibility. It's worth ending on a final note that one of the things we can all do whilst doing those things, which are important, those trying to bring about small-scale improvements, is not about just about big schemes. It gets to the point that when we started this study, as a notion, effectively now 3.5 years ago, we found that the searchlights that lit Nelson on top of his column in Trafalgar Square were missing Nelson. We found that the quality of lights from our street lamps were too bright for the street and for the square. We changed the light bulbs. We eventually got the various government departments that have been involved in manning the searchlights, a bizarre story in itself and another chapter for the autobiography, to get together, appoint a budget head and get someone to do it and carry out the conservation audit of Whitehall at the same time. Great credit to them. And now the searchlights hit Nelson. Now the statues are being repaired. Therefore, the job of the planner in considering the politics of conservation and restoration is to advance the philosophical and general debates, to consider at all times Roy Powell's question, whose city? Who are you doing this for? Who do you have to square? But the one thing that many commentators, and I go back to Jane Jacobs, Ian Nairn, and the entire civic trust movement in this country, the management of the public realm. It has, from the 16th century in this country, been the main reasons local authorities existed. To repair the roads, to sweep the streets. Westminster Paving Act 1762 is but a specific example to us. It matters. It affects how people vote, why they vote, why you have cities in the first place. And so one cannot overlook the rather boring, perhaps, but absolutely vital area of city management, whilst proselytising and quietly promoting ideas that are much more radical in nature and scope. Thank you very much.
We'll talk about medieval, we'll discuss neoclassical, but of course the main interest goes to 19th and 20th century cities in which we are living in. Naturally, the invitees are people that in fact have different interests, from the practical architect to the engineer and planner, the government official, and of course to the aficionados of the subjects. So going on today with our historic center, policies, legislation, and reality, we go to this third of our speaker. I see Mr. Schneider is here. You're going on. Okay. So why don't I ask Mr. Graham King Lugin Keeley, Professor Keeley, who is coming from Dublin. He is a professor of architecture at the National University of Ireland in Dublin, and he is a graduate in philosophy and architecture. He took a degree, a master's of architecture from the University of Berkeley in California. Mr. Keeling is going to be discussing today the historic centers, progress and contradiction in policy and practice in Ireland. So, Professor Keeley.
Try it. And this first projector is not working.
So I'll just put the slide afterwards.
Oh, okay. Good morning. We may have a slight problem with the slide projectors, so if you'll excuse, there'll be a little awkwardness, I think, in the sequence of images. I would like to say how pleased I am to be here and to have an opportunity to speak to you, and to signal my thanks to Dr Ikonomou and to the staff of the Architectural Association for inviting me. One of the problems that we have coming from Ireland is more or less the same as I think it was Winston Churchill said about the division between the United States and England as two countries divided by a common language. So I would say to you, just as a way of starting off, saying that you're dealing with something which is rather different from the UK experience, I'd simply say, Tá an áthastan bheithan seo inniu agus tá buíochorm, go dú an Dr Ikonomou agus lucht an as ocht an gléach a chur siad orm, which means exactly what I said before. But at least it gives us perhaps a point of departure. Now, policy and progress. If we could have the first slide, please. There are two words that signal hope and belief. Policy signals the hope that the application of ideas will make the world better. And progress, I think, signals the belief that the world has in some way become a better place than it was before. Modernism has always been about belief in progress, usually heavily salted with the fear of failure. And the tragedies, I think, of the first half of this century have also seen the emergence of the essential questions of personal and social identity and the role of the inherited built environment in the formation of identity. But is formation also creation? And the subtext to what I have to say on the matter of policy and progress in Ireland is that the role that the inherited environment plays in this matter can be ambiguous, and that especially in the context of a society in transition, it's important to identify what's happening. Now, I would say Irish society is in transition. I would guess that European society is in transition. The past decade has seen significant physical change in historic centres in Ireland. For the first time since the 18th century, building development has targeted the town and city centres as much as it has their peripheries. A few years ago, city centre populations were in apparently terminal decline. Apartment living was only for social housing and carried the kind of stigma that would go with that. Today, public interest in urban living is rising, and new apartments in city centres are being sold, as I say, off the plans or within days of coming on the market. Dublin city centre has witnessed a major influx of new residents, and as yet there is no sign that the demand for apartments has been satisfied. There is greater social heterogeneity in the city centre. Smaller cities, such as Cork and Galway, have had similar experience. But all of this is only the most recent phase of a transformation that goes back a generation. A transformation which has seen Irish society change from one based predominantly on rural settlements and small towns to an urban society with a discernible urban-rural divide in attitudes and values. At this point, I'll simply say that this phenomenon is significant in terms of cultural and social development, and I'll come back to discuss its significance later on. But first, the place of conservation in this situation. On the face of things, public interest in conservation has never been stronger. Recent developments in legislation have brought new actors into play, and impending legislation will demand adjustments in planning policy and practice with regard to the inherited built environment. One of the more significant developments in public policy with regard to the built environment derives simply from the reorganisation of the Office of Public Works, which is an organisation very similar to the English model, which we've derived from your occupation some time ago. In the early 1990s, functions relating to the care of the built and natural heritage were detached from the Office of Public Works and placed under a new ministry. A new body with the Irish name of Dóchas, which means heritage simply, is responsible for heritage matters under the Minister for Arts, Heritage, the Gaeltacht and the Islands. The Gaeltacht referring to a word describing the Irish-speaking areas of the country. This ministry also has an influential policy unit which acts as the engine for much of the current developments. The Heritage Act of 1995 established a Heritage Council, also under the agents of the Heritage Ministry, but with an autonomous function to advise the Minister on policy and priorities for the protection of heritage, and to develop awareness of the heritage in the community at large. It has, in addition, specified functions under the Planning Acts and can advise the Minister on designation of heritage buildings. The significance of that is that such designation automatically freezes any proposals in relation to those particular buildings. The Council may also acquire property, and it also has a capacity to grant aid conservation work, although this is quite limited at present. Another development was in 1996, where the Irish government published two documents, one called Strengthening the Protection of the Architectural Heritage, and the second one called Developing a Government Policy on Architecture. The first of these documents on strengthening the protection of heritage was the fruit of an interdepartmental working group set up by the responsible ministries, the Heritage Ministry and the Department of the Environment, to examine deficiencies in the legislative and administrative systems as they related to the protection of the architectural heritage. For many years, there have been two sets of legislative provisions in Ireland. The National Monuments Acts, derived from the Act of 1931 that John Redmell referred to yesterday with its later amendments, and the Planning Acts, initially formulated in 1963, modelled on those in place in Britain, and of course incorporating regulations and amendments since. The focus for the working group was influenced by the terms of the Granada Convention of 1985, which Ireland had signed but had not ratified. The second paper, that regarding policy on architecture, was a discussion document and arose from an initiative of the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland And this resulted in the responsible minister agreeing to participate in a project to explore just what a government policy on architecture might address. Both of these groups, the different documents, worked for about a year, and although they had very different focus in terms of references and methods of work, and their outcomes were quite different, with regard to the architectural heritage, they display an underlying consistency. The interdepartmental report, first, on strengthening the protection of heritage, has resulted in proposals to amend the two bodies of legislation, the Planning Acts and the National Monuments Acts, removing the anomalies, and the changes in the Planning Acts are now at an advanced stage, and they may come before the government during the present parliamentary session. Changes in the Monuments Acts are now being drafted. It was felt that the changes in the Planning Acts were more urgent. The current proposals, as a body, envisage the establishment of a comprehensive architectural inventory covering the entire country, which we don't have, and we are also committed to it under the terms of the Granada Convention. We also will have, it is to be hoped, a comprehensive system of protection through the Planning Acts that are based on this inventory, and an improved grant system to support conservation action. The discussion document on architectural policy was widely circulated, and after receiving submissions last year, the government adopted the document's 6 principles as the basis for a policy on architecture. And probably it would just be simplest to quote from the document what they are. And it says, in pursuing its policy on architecture, the government will, 1, promote high standards of design and construction in building works for which it is responsible, and support the pursuit of high standards in building generally. 2, develop an organisational framework which facilitates the application of knowledge and skills concerning the built environment. 3, ensure the architectural heritage is conserved and maintained to a high standard. 4, foster the demand for high-quality architecture in the community as a whole. 5, promote the concept of sustainable development. And 6, encourage innovation in architecture. These principles, among other things, place the protection of the architectural heritage and architectural innovation side by side as ways in which architecture is expressive of culture. In pursuit of its policy agenda, the government has just announced that it has established, again, an interdepartmental working group to determine how these heads of policy are to be implemented in the various departments of government. Now, these are all, at one level, positive developments. Even if resources fall short of meeting aspirations, as they will do, the situation regarding protection of architectural heritage is some way better than it was a decade ago. But the social and cultural transformations brought about in the wake of industrialization and urbanization mean that one should look more closely, not as a purely cynical exercise, but because conservation policy and practice are going to be expressed in the context of rapid and, I'd say, quite radical change. It's important to examine aspirations in the belief that the issues that are facing my country are not unique to us alone. So where does one begin? It has been remarked that the buildings of the past help contemporary society to, and I quote, ground a shaken identity. The proposition implies, I think, that historic buildings are a force for cohesion, that in the appreciation of their historical, architectural, and cultural importance, there is a factor that draws society together. Are historic buildings a force for cohesion in the face of rapid social and economic transformation in Ireland in the final years of this century? Now, earlier I said that interest in architectural heritage has deepened and the resources devoted to its conservation have substantially increased. But if one looks a little further, one encounters that part of the ideology of conservation which sees the use of monuments as, and I quote, instruments of knowledge and cultural development, unquote. If one takes an overview of the architectural conservation scene in Ireland, we will find some interesting anomalies. A generation ago, systematic conservation work was predominantly confined to operations by the Office of Public Works in fulfilment of its obligations under the Monuments Acts. It generally amounted to low-key maintenance of prehistoric monuments, early Christian remains and monastic sites, with one or two exceptions, as John Redmond pointed out yesterday. Generally speaking, though, national monuments were by definition pre-1700. That date, as I say, allowed public expenditure on castles and early fortifications as well, but there was virtually no support whatever for the repair and maintenance of the great legacy of 18th and 19th century building in the country. Most notably, there was a distinct anti-urban bias in planning policies and very little control over the rapid destruction of surviving 17th, 18th and 19th century fabric in urban areas. Now, I'll press these buttons. I don't know what's going to happen. Let's see. See what happens. It's not supposed to be that, at any rate. Did we go back one on that one? No, it's going the wrong way. Right. Okay. Thank you. I should do it for the moment. So recent years have, as I said, seen the expenditure of very large sums of money on buildings of the, well, I didn't say this before, but I'm saying now, of sums on buildings of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. And the state has taken under its care some important examples of the architecture of these times. But with regard to the more modest buildings that comprise urban fabric, there is very, very little attention paid to historic interiors. Conservation through the planning system still prioritizes the facade. When new buildings are inserted, there is a timorous preference for pastiche, one, I must say, in which conservators generally silently collude. There is little organized information and still less active conservation work relating to vernacular, industrial and early modern buildings. All of this now would lead one to question what architectural heritage actually means. And so to find at least a partial answer, one has to, I think, to go a little bit into the realm of social history and cultural change. I do this in the consciousness that we are in the process of change even now, and that this process involves a constant rearticulation and exploration of meaning and interpretation of events. Now we'll see. Oh, wrong one, sorry. Right. The anti-urban bias of planning policies had its roots in nationalist culture. In the course of the 19th century, when Irish nationalism developed its distinctive ethos, the literature of the time fostered the myth of the landless Catholic peasant, if you like, a nobler version and counterpoint of the paddy of the British stage and satirical magazines. And with it came the myth of Irish culture as being essentially rural. That myth was to prove remarkably persistent. And it penetrated very deeply indeed into the psyche of emerging nationalism. Not only did it engender a naive acceptance of the superiority of the rural over the urban life, but it effectively subverted the urban history of the island, turning it into a simple manifestation of colonial occupation. It supported planning policies, of course, then, that were destructive of the urban physical fabric. In that culture, it was possible for a government minister to lampoon those protesting against the destruction of George in Dublin as, and I quote, long-haired lackeys of belted earls. Declan Kyberd, in a recent book called Inventing Ireland, The Literature of a Modern Nation, refers to a paradoxical celebration of aristocratic values by some leaders of cultural nationalism in the early years of the century, in which anyone could claim to be descended from Gaelic chieftains. One of its lasting effects was to blur the consciousness of social division and injustice in favour of a unifying cultural myth. Now, wrong one again. Right. This painting is known as Madonna Irlanda, or the first real Irish political picture. In Ireland today, identity is not just being shaken. Contemporary experience of violence and social and political dissonance has made it difficult to retain faith in traditional versions of the past, and there has been a progressive elaboration in the understanding of history. An identity is being constructed, and it is being constructed with an acute awareness of the fact of its construction, a process once described as turning inside out without breaking the shell. In Ireland as elsewhere, the process of modernization has conflated the idea of development with economic growth, and the culture of tradition has been replaced by the culture of progress. Now again, sorry, I'm pushing the wrong buttons all the time here. Right, okay. The experience of struggle for political, economic, and intellectual independence has been overtaken by the attempt to articulate a version of history which could mitigate the differences and provide a coherent description of what constitutes an Irish identity. Coming to terms with the urban present has meant a gradual coming to terms with the urban past. And at first, this process fell into the ready-made cultural trap. Urban life was celebrated as a mirror image of the peasant life of nationalist myth. Urban community was pictured in romantic terms. The presentation of life, I quote, in the queer old times, was a perversion of the realities, presented so loosely by playwrights like O'Casey and Behan, realities which were systematically subverted and trivialized by the interpretations of theatrical directors and literary reviewers. It is only in recent years, with the publication of works of rigorous scholarship, that we are beginning to articulate the complexities involved and to understand the roles played by civil and religious authorities, and to explore the role of economic and political circumstances in creating the urban architectural heritage of today. So in conclusion, if indeed our monuments are to be instruments of, quote, knowledge and cultural development, then the basis for conservation and interpretation is critical. There is particular need for thought about the concepts that are implicitly presented by the acts of conservation and interpretation. The correlation, for example, between power, wealth, and cultural importance has been the subject of some attention in the critical literature on the preservation of heritage, on the basis that that connection is usually unstated. Ideological positions in conservation should be addressed and made explicit. One notes that nowadays, when Irish architectural heritage is featured in the media, the churches and castles are joined by the great and lesser Georgian houses of town and country, but that whole categories of buildings are still excluded. If we are willing to challenge this correlation between cultural importance on the one hand and power and wealth on the other, then we can resolve perhaps some of the anomalies that are present in our approach to conservation as it is now. And there is, of course, a key role for scholarship in establishing the many layers that comprise the truth of the role of the built environment, and thereby legitimizing whole areas of sublimated cultural experience. The neglect of vernacular buildings will be seen to rest uneasily with the country's genuine agrarian history and the struggle for land. The neglect of industrial buildings will be seen for what it is, a perpetuation of the myth that the Industrial Revolution passed us by. The fact that we ignore our early modern buildings might lead us to question, well, might lead us either to question the commitment to modernization of the state's founding fathers, or to recognize that commitment and put policies and practices in place. I suppose in one area we have been fairly consistent. Our transition from a confessional state to a secular society is reflected in our neglect of redundant churches. To be fair, however, a measure of hope can be gleaned from recent initiatives by the Heritage Council and UCAS in these areas. The slide on the right is actually an excerpt from a joint publication by the Department of the Environment of Northern Ireland and our own Department of Arts and Heritage into a study of traditional thatch that's now underway. Most importantly, with regard to urban conservation, we may be able to take on two fundamental questions. We may be able to progress beyond pious rhetoric and actively support high-quality architecture and challenge our acquiescence as conservationists in the imposition of fake historic buildings in architecturally sensitive areas. We also may be able to find ourselves able to support measures to conserve the social fabric of historic centres and to help devise realistic counters to the erosion of urban communities through the process of gentrification, which actually threatens the continuity and the viability of urban centres as they modernise. Now that indeed would be progress. Thank you very much.
Kade Melier Faltia. He didn't hear it. He didn't hear it. God, it's as bad as that, my accent. Can I say it again? Kade Melier Faltier.
Thank you very much.
John Redmill gave me a crash course, in fact, in Irish. Okay, we're going on with Mr. Schneider. As a conclusion of my paper yesterday, we said that the issues presented were not unique to the city of Berlin. We saw, in fact, one further example with the city of London and another example with the city of Dublin. In the 18th century, Berlin was Paris envy. The moment for the western expansion of the city was the Royal Squares of Paris. One of them, with the same name, after the Napoleonic Wars, is going to be the topic of the paper of Mr. Schneider. We hope that the adventures of development of this so-called saloon of the city will provoke further discussions this afternoon. Now, Mr. Schneider is an architect and planner in Berlin. He's a consultant to the Senator of Science, Research and Culture and to Berlin Partners, which is the capital city's marketing company. He was a visiting professor at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, founding member of the German Society of Semiotic Studies, and member of the steering group of the Stat Forum that we mentioned even yesterday. So, Mr. Snyder. Oops.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a way I can continue where Mr. Keeley began, talking about history as invention or invented histories. With the question, who actually is defining the politics of conservation and restoration for a country, for a city, or even for a single building? Like in other political fields, legislation, bylaws, professional rules, the whole formal apparatus is always only one side of the affair. The other side are the political conditions, the states of minds, and the conditions of the application or rejection or neglection of those rules and laws. In the real decision-making process, there are many more informal forces and influences of any kind, professional and non-professional ones, public and secret ones, which obviously are sometimes more efficient in shaping the city than any official, professional, and scientific criteria of conservation ever can be. Now, Berlin, as we already discussed yesterday, is a special case among the big European cities, in the sense that Berlin has been destroyed. That is now an event 2 generations ago, but still it is the basic experience of Berlin to have been destroyed. And this background of total destruction conveys a different meaning to the problems of conservation and restoration than in any other place and in other cities. So if history is being thought of or felt of as the positive identity of a place, a city whose identity is founded on destruction is in trouble. Therefore, it's very much understandable that history has to, unavoidably has to become an invention. You cannot rely on a negative experience in the long run. Especially if there is no confidence in the force and the productive potential of contemporary culture, of modernism. So these are two sides of one medal, the crisis of modernism and the crisis of conservation and restoration. And one has to take this into account when talking about conservation and restoration in Berlin. In Berlin, there's a overruling, predominant, desperate need for compensation of losses. That is the main motif, cultural motif in Berlin. And desperate need can be taken literally. There is something there's a tone of despair in the city, despite all the new developments and the situation of the new era after the reunification of the city. Now, the case of Pariser Platz, you see that history of destruction. It is a very intriguing example of the substitution of professional standards by political reconstruction guidelines of quite another nature. We all know the Brandenburg Gate as the historical emblem of Cold War, reconstructed but isolated amidst the wasteland which marked the division not only of Germany's capital city, but also of the continent and the world. I see two essential features of this situation. One of these two features is, in fact, the polarization between the gate as a national, even international landmark on one side, and the total evacuation of any physical remnant of its former existence, and at least in the immediate surroundings. This absence of anything reminding of a former city became a total new and forcefully meaningful context, which conveyed also to the gate new meanings, which it did not have before. Being inaccessible to the public, it became more visible than ever before. One of Europe's most eminently public buildings. The second feature is the duration, the span of time covered by this state of affairs, almost 50 years. The Brandenburg Gate was opened, as we heard yesterday, by Dr. Haspel in 1791. This is 200 years ago. Its post-war condition, in its isolation, that is, covers almost 1/4 of its biography, so to speak, 1/4 of that existence of the gate. The authorities, politicians, and cultural spokesmen, though, who after Berlin's reunification defined the reconstruction policy for Pariser Platz in front of the gate, wanted, of course, to overcome as soon as possible and as radically as possible the horror and shame of the gate's existence behind barbed wire and behind the wall. They wanted the new born-again Pariser Platz to shape its future image through an act of incantation of better times, somewhere between, let's say, 1871 and 1933. Neglecting the etymological meaning of the German term Geschichte for history, which means that was happened, geschehen. So what happened the last 50 years ought to be abolished. That is the condition to grasp back to history again. That is a very contradictory situation. And you see on the right picture the last remnant. That is a photograph taken supposedly in 1960. That was the last of the last remnant, the last ruin on the square present, and that was torn down in the context of the building of the Berlin Wall. So it is about conservation and restoration in the case of Berlin, as I said yesterday, is about destruction of destruction. Somebody observed already that by removing the ruins of the war, we ruined the city. We wiped out history. But inevitably, in the case of cities like Berlin, abolishing a ruin means getting rid of destruction. The bigger the ruin you remove, the more you clear the place for new life. So abolishing history is a strange dialectical way of assuring yourself of your historical roots. If we have now a closer look to the prescriptions and demands imposed on the architects of the new Pariser Platz, we discover that not only 1/4 of the biography of the Brandenburg Gate has been eliminated. Even more intriguing is the fact that the historical references given instead are to a great deal fallacious and downright false. The zeal of healing the wounds of the ill-treated and heavily injured city lead to a strange misinterpretation of history based on mere inventions, which in fact lead to the opposite result of what the authors of those prescriptions might have intended. There's nothing wrong, I suppose, with the idea of bringing Pariser Platz back into existence. The overall context of Berlin's inner city spatial pattern clearly suggests the reconstruction of the carré, which as a two-dimensional square in the ground survived its post-war phase of quarantine. In its origin, the square was part of the late Baroque Western expansion of 1734 to the quarter called Friedrichstadt. 3 big gate squares inside the city walls were shaped and originally also named as geometric primary figures. There was the rondelle, you showed the picture yesterday, the later Belle Alliance Platz. Belle Alliance is a village near Waterloo. That is the German notion for Waterloo. And there was the Octagon, the Leipziger Platz, and there was the Carré, the Pariser Platz. These later names taken for the Prussian victories over after the fall of Napoleon in the liberation wars. Pariser Platz thus makes part of a historically testified wider urban pattern. To make the gate the focus of architectural and spatial reference for a future development is also convincing. What bothers me, though, is the apparent conceptual insecurity, the innocent and naive reconstruction policy which took over. Let us start with the very surface of the square itself. In its origin, the essence of the carré was a literal square, the primary geometrical figure of the square. That had been transformed already around the turn of the century into, as you see on the right side, into a street. It sort of prolonged the section of Unter den Linden just by introducing these 2 apparently innocent lawn pieces. So this already was sort of a deviation from the original meaning of that square in the times of the Wilhelminian embellishment of the city. So there was nothing to really to be restored after the elimination of the last remnant I showed you on the northern square front in the 60s, shown before. The gate and the city pattern remained the only points of historical reference. And all the former or new landowners, users, and developers wanted to build as soon as possible at once, and with the greatest ambition, on one of Europe's foremost places. You see that transformation of the square surface and that older picture, air view, and that is the situation from the ground. The first thing to be restored after the fall of the wall were these two lawn pieces. So one grasped to the apparently immediately present remnant of some historical meaning. By the way, these two fountains introduced a strange neo-Baroque cross-axis across the gate, sort of neutralizing the main axis dominated by the gate. The first project which asked for permission was the hotel chain which wanted to reconstruct one of Berlin's best-known hotels, the Adlon. On the left picture you see the pre-war version of that hotel. On the right side there is the corner of that hotel, and again you see following that gutter line the walkway, which again and still follows the line of Unter den Linden, instead of widening up the place again, the square, as it originally had been meant. Other clients beside that important hotel were the United States, the French Republic with their respective embassies, the Prussian Akademie der Künste, the Academy of Arts, and other prominent owners, banks in this prominent place. So what an incredible opportunity for an ambitious political project. In this square, which is to become kind of the lobby to the German political center of power. Just behind the gate, there's the parliament in the Reichstag. Then there's the chancellery, and not far away there's the president of the republic. But nobody brought those clients together. Nobody asked for the conceptual excellence, for joint action, for joint ventures of politics, administration, architecture, and urbanism. Instead, the building administration submitted to the parliament a set of rules and prescriptions which any design on the square had to follow. And the official justification for that way of proceeding was that there were no reliable cultural consensus in the present. So, for lack of public consensus, the administration ought to set the standards in reality, and the evidence is the fact that nobody asked for that, nobody tested, nobody checked that possible consensus. So maybe in reality, I suppose the consensus of contemporary architecture and urbanism was all too well known to those people. And they were afraid of it and hated it and wanted to prevent it by all means by their rules. One of those rules, for instance, says every facade should be symmetrical. But if you take a look at the pre-war situation of the place, in the documentation, you see that before the destruction, half of the buildings were symmetrical, half of them were not. So it's up to you to decide what is the rule and what is the exception. But, of course, in times of shaky security, symmetry is always reliable, the most simple principle of order. Always the very popular smallest denominator of all times. So to speak, the essence of order is symmetry. So if historical facts don't match those ideas, those rules, all the worse for reality. Another rule requires the principle of that's the wrong one. The principle of the Lochfassade, so the perforated wall as the principle for the facade. And another rule establishes a certain ratio of opened surfaces in relation to closed ones, and limits the maximum size of possible openings, single openings. And every new building had to lift its ground floor 1.2 meters above ground, referring to the rule of the former city palazzo type, which allegedly once dominated the architecture of the square, but of which no single item had survived. So also this typological standard is sort of an incantation of a lost history. Two very interesting prescriptions refer to the Brandenburg Gate itself, because the gate was meant to set the standards for anything else on the square, which, as far as I'm concerned, is very fine. But the rule says that the material of all the facades should harmonize with the sandstone of the gate. But as already Dr. Haspel mentioned yesterday, originally the gate, of course, was a messenger of the new proto-classicist ideal of Greek, Roman culture and antiquity. Of course, it should have been made out of marble. It ought to become a kind of Berlin's Marble Arch. But who in the poor and austere Prussian economy of the late 18th century could afford marble? Not even the king. And if he had had the money, he would have had to put it into his army, not into cultural endeavors. So the gate was made out of the cheapest material possible, the cheapest material available, namely sandstone, and plastered and painted over with lime. It was white. So the material appeal of sandstone is a very modern obsession. And the rule to apply sandstone or similar materials for all the new buildings on the Pariser Platz 200 years later refer to historical facts in a rather oblique way. A more generalizing rule for the new building says that not downright uniformity, but at least stylistic accommodation and conformity ought to be pursued. Again, referring to the dominance of the gate, which should not be disturbed. But this gate itself had entered the city as a total stranger. You see that on the left side. This gate had no precedent in its times in the city whatsoever. It opposed the aesthetics of the late Baroque palaces standing around and did away with their weak and repetitious architecture, which 2 generations later Schinkel himself still attacked. The rule of the gate was deviation and ruthless contradiction to the existing, not accommodation or assimilation. It came, so to speak, from outer space, out of nowhere. It was the architectural proclamation of a new era. The later development around it, though, you see that on the right, was not the era that the gate had proclaimed, but it was a continuous series of attempts to tame its rigorous novelty, to integrate it, and thereby to subdue its disquieting otherness. From restoration, with Stühler's neighboring palace there on the right, who was a pupil of Schinkel's, to downright reactionary contradiction in the neo-Baroque reinterpretation of city space under Kaiser Wilhelm I and II. The first edition of Berlin und seine Bauten, Berlin and its buildings, observed already, that was published in 1877, that by raising the adjacent buildings to the height of the gate, it was to a great deal robbed of its strength. I want to add also, not only by heightening the adjacent buildings, but also by expanding the axial symmetry of the gate itself over the 2 adjacent buildings by Stühler. So the 19th century history of the Pariser Platz can be read as a process of counter-reaction against the Brandenburg Gate, culminating in the neo-Baroque anti-classicist palaces of the turn of the century. Now, the people programming the new Pariser Platz of tomorrow, and even prominent architects like Joseph Paul Kleihues, who did these two, the paraphrases, the new paraphrases of these old Stühler buildings, take special pride in the rule that the gate's height sets the standard for all other buildings around. The famous Berlin gutter line, the common gutter line. But what happens in reality by doing this? The intention to honor the Brandenburg Gate as the outstanding venerable landmark around is being transformed almost into its opposite. It is not allowed to be outstanding, to stand out, except for its great quadriga. It does not have its own height anymore, but it is being accommodated to the common height of the square around. So not the square follows the height of the gate, but in effect the gate follows the height of the common height of the city around. So that is sort of first year basic architectural theory. That is as simple as it is. Of course, there was also a study in the early 90s which suggested to reconstruct the lower two-story height, which was shown before, of the 18th and early 19th century. But of course, on this prime land in the city with all these prominent owners, it was simply not feasible to devaluate the ground by 50% or less. Maybe designing the new buildings higher than the gate would have been a version worth thinking about. Lower or higher, both might have worked in the attempt of showing the difference between the gate and the surroundings. But sticking to the exact same height certainly is not a sign of a great historical understanding of the message of that architecture, but of the zeitgeist obsessions and cultural biases ruling our times, as for instance the prescription of axial symmetry of facades or the belief in geometrical uniformity. The same holds for the question of materials and colors. The more you assimilate the features of the square to the gate, the more you neutralize the gate. It is as simple as this. Any kind of disturbing feature in a city can easily be neutralized by simple repetition. Every architect knows this. The result now, which we have got, is a gate which follows the rules of the square in height and material, not the other way around. So if the historical truth of the gate is diversity, otherness, then one can say that there is a dilemma for contemporary reconstruction of the Pariser Platz. Either you take the gate seriously and want to enhance it in its authentic dignity, then you cannot possibly follow the late 19th century Pariser Platz, whose aim and whose effect was the conceptual neutralization of the gate. Or you stick to your ideas of the square for the sake of history, whatever that means, how misleading that ever might be. But then you cannot pretend to respect the gate as the standard setting instance. The idea of harmony between the gate and the Pariser Platz is a pure invention and can easily be falsified by simple observations which every layman can make, if he's not mesmerized by his projection called history. So if it is not necessarily a mere invention, what then is history? What is this past seen through our present eyes? What does that mean? And inevitably linked to this question, what is history, is the other basic question. What is architectural and urban design? If it is not simply a set of rules or architectural fashions, nor the authorities' claim for law and order. The origin of all these problems is the sort of a principle statement which has been made over and over again in the early 90s in Berlin. Namely, Berlin has so vast opportunities, so many occasions for contemporary architecture. So please, let's preserve the core places for historical authenticity. I am deeply convinced that historical competence and contemporary design competence are intrinsically intertwined and sort of Siamese twins. They cannot be divided. If you kill one, the other dies as well. Or the other way around, historical competence is always as good or as weak as your design competence. Thank you. Show that one last picture maybe. You see how far the attempt of adaptation and accommodation goes, shown by Kleihu's building. You have two sets of flutes, vertical flutes and horizontal ones.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Schneider. I'm sure that the provocations given are going to be central to our discussion this afternoon. We go on with Dr. Tripodakis, who comes from Athens. The city of Athens, as we all know, a very new, but at the same time a very old city. New because its plans that have a lot to do with the beginning of classicism, if you want, were done around the 1830s by German architects, or German-educated Greek planners. Let's not forget the plan of Klenze and the plan of Kleanthes for the city of Athens, who was, of course, a student of Schinkel. What Mr. Tripodakis is going to talk, Dr. Tripodakis is going to talk about today is, in fact, a new project which is attempting to create some kind of a new order in the center of the city. It deals of the reunification of the archaeological sites of the city and the creation of a park in the widest sense of the word, which will be pedestrian and which will be, in fact, following certain standards given by the committee of the unification. A few words about Mr. Tripodakis. He studied in Athens. He is, of course, an architect. And he went to Harvard University, where he took his master in city planning and urban design. Today, he is the vice president of the organization of the unification of archaeological sites of Athens. So this is the topic of his talk. Dr. Tripodakis.
I would like to thank the organizers of this event and Professor Ikonomou in particular for giving me the opportunity to revisit the Architectural Association after several years. And picking it up from where the previous speaker left it, that is with respect to history and identity, Mr. Schneider, that is. Let me begin my presentation with the following. A tourist walks through the archaeological site of the ancient Agora in Athens and says, this is such a lovely place, it's in ruins. So some people were alarmed for the sake of the joke, I'm saying it, alarmed by this remark and decided to do something about it. Not restore the ruins, of course, but protect them, enhance their potential and bring them together in one unified whole, into one archaeological park. And this is a project I'm about to present to you. And my presentation is separated into three parts. The first part, presenting shortly the recent development of Athens in the last 150 years. Second part, giving some brief information about the planning laws and planning situation concerning the city. And the third part is the main part of the presentation, addressing the program itself of the unification, with three sections: information about the site, a description of the objectives of the program, and finally the program itself. I will try and combine slide projection and transparency, so there may be some Athens, a city symbol for mankind, the city where democracy was born and matured, and at the same time a city of contradictions. A historic city built on the site of the ancient one, but also a new town without a past. Although the first inhabitants settled in the area around 3000 BC, after the War of Independence. Do I control the slide projection from here, or? Sorry, it's forward. All right, thank you very much. Okay, this is the plan of the ancient city, the perimeter delineated by the Themistoclean wall, in the center of the hill of the Acropolis. Most of the city was developed in the northern part. Two talented architects, the Greek Stamatis Kleanthis and the Bavarian Edward Schaubert, both students of Karl Schinkel, have been charged with the elaboration of the plan of the new town. These are views of the town at that period from the southwest, from Megaleo, and from the northeast, from Penteli. In the background, the hill of the Acropolis. This plan, which was elaborated by Schaubert and Kleanthis, follows the principles of the Romantic neoclassicism, and the main idea was a northward development for the new city and the rehabilitation of the center of the ancient town through extensive excavations around the Acropolis. The ancient splendor of the town was, after all, the basic argument for its choice as the new capital. The idea of the definition of a cultural historic zone was therefore present from the very beginning. You see the hill of the Acropolis in the lower part. The plan itself was rather geometric and arbitrary. The basic axes form an equilateral triangle, giving too much attention to the perspectives of the main axis, but had many advantages on the other hand. Unfortunately, it has been unfavorably received by the citizens, and in 1834, Leo von Klenze introduced a new plan, which is a compromise between the architect's vision and the private interests. These rules still prevail in Athens and all over Greece. This plan modified the previous one mainly by proposing narrower streets and by reducing open spaces in the area dedicated to archaeological research. In 1860, Klenze's plan was readapted by a committee, the Stavridis Committee, for a population of 50,000. With the exception of a few modifications, this plan formed the nucleus of the city and is responsible for the form of the center in contemporary Athens. The city grew to 453,000 people in 1920, and only in 1928, after the massive wave of refugees from Asia Minor, to a city of 800,000 inhabitants. These are the three plans referring to these periods, 1900, 1950, and 1997 on the right. On the eve of the Second World War, Athens was already a city of 1,140,000 inhabitants. The years following 1950 marked a period of total post-war restructuring of the country. Athens developed even higher rates of economic and demographic increases, propelled by a significant concentration of industrial activity in the area. By 1981, Athens was a metropolis of 3.4 million inhabitants. Today, the Greater Athens area, well, we have problems with the slides. Well, technology seems to be a problem even today. Well, some time ago, I was in Japan for a conference, and we had a similar problem. So I said, if it happens with Japanese, then it can happen anyway.
You're just switching it off, that's all.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Well, today, the Greater Athens area constitutes a modern metropolis with unique physical, aesthetic, and cultural assets, which signify both its ancient and modern history. It is a self-contained region of the country, the region of Attica. It is the largest region in the country in terms of population and density, as well as economic activity. It contains 157 local government municipalities and 4 prefectures. The area houses the 34% of the country's population, while its geographic area does not exceed the 3% of the country's total area. Until 1922, the Greater Athens area expanded concentrically around the 2 centers of Athens and Piraeus, its port, which had their own city proper plans. The next transparency, please. So these are the centers of Athens and Piraeus, connected by the long walls in the classical times. During the following decades, and mainly after 1950, 2 principal trends of urban concentration became apparent. The trend towards density increases in central areas, and the trend of the expansion of the city with illegal building. One thing is now more than obvious. The old, quiet town with the historic monuments and low structures, separated from nearby smaller municipalities by a wide belt of suburban green, does not exist anymore. It exploded in all directions and breathes heavily under the load of pressing problems related to environmental quality, social disparities, transportation and infrastructure inadequacies, and last but not least, spatial disorder. Whether or not all these problems will find a solution, it is difficult to say. At the same time, however, the historic center does exist, and the monuments, although spread out within the city's urban fabric, constitute a precious cultural heritage both for inhabitants and visitors. I will now refer to the second part of my presentation, the planning, laws, and situation for Athens. Attempts at comprehensive urban and regional planning for the Greater Athens area began after World War II. These efforts continued during the 60s, and by the end of the 70s, they culminated to legislation of basic goals through a framework plan called Capital 2000. Finally, in 1985, a law specific to Athens, called the Structural Plan and Program for the Environmental Protection of the Greater Athens Area, was passed by the Parliament. And this is a plan accompanying the law. The Athens Structural Plan, also known as a master plan, seeks to set forth the principal axis for the future development for the area. The general goals and directions of this plan are listed in Article 3 of Law 1515, and among them 2 are directly related to the program of the unification of Athens' archaeological sites. First, the promotion of Athens' historical physiognomy and the upgrading of its central area. And second, the improvement of the quality of life for all its residents and the protection of the natural environment. At a smaller scale, related to the city center, what we call the general urban plan provides, among others, for an archaeological park and the upgrading of quality of life through the renovation of degraded districts. The general urban plan is on the right, on the left, sorry. This archaeological park in the central area of the town, a large open museum, consists of the most famous ancient and Byzantine monuments, the old city, and other buildings, squares, axes, areas of historic character. And I will now enter the main part of my presentation, which is actually the program of unification, what we like to call an open museum to the world. Athens' archaeological sites constitute the principal element of the city's cultural heritage, as well as the most vivid witness of its historic continuity through the ages. Their unification has been for decades a dream for architects, urban planners, and inhabitants. Again, you see the hill of the Acropolis here, and all the red dots representing important buildings or spaces. The term unification means the creation of an interconnected land network containing as major elements the monuments and archaeological sites, and also incorporating open spaces, common green, service facilities, and areas designated for cultural activities and recreation. Simultaneously, this network will be situated in close physical correlation with the city's central functions network, so that passing through this unified zone will not only be a conscious choice, but also an automatic consequence of the area's more general use and movement in the urban space. The program is a multi-sectoral venture involving principally two ministries, the Ministry of Environment, Planning and Public Works, and the Ministry of Culture. These ministries set up a common unification program on the basis of Athens' structural plan and of the City of Athens' general urban plan. And this is rather unique for Greek reality, for two ministries to collaborate so closely for a common goal. These photographs here show parts of this unification plan. This is the area of the Academy of Plato, connecting the Academy to the ancient cemetery of Keramikos. And this is the area around the Acropolis and across, including across the hill of Philopapos. To this direction, the two ministries established a flexible organization in order to undertake the responsibility for implementing the program and create one of the world's largest and most significant open museums for the city's inhabitants and its visitors. This is the company I'm representing today, called the Unification of Archaeological Sites of Athens, SA. This SA will try to create an environment which evolves as a result of both new and old buildings, of ancient and modern parts of the historic center, and the recognition that the city is a continuum relating both to our past and our future. A few words about the site. Today, the archaeological sites of Athens occupy a total land area of approximately 700 hectares. They're spread out in the city's urban fabric, unconnected between them, not integrated in the activities of everyday life, and subject to the environmental pollution produced in a typical large metropolis. A serious consequence of this situation is a gradual loss of the city's historical continuity and the slow erosion of the idea of Athens, the identity of the city that is, in the conscience of its citizens and those who live the experience of this city. It is worth noting that the more significant green, non-built areas, excluding the National Garden, which is this area here, are found around sites of archaeological interest. These are the green spaces, again, photographs of the model, which are being brought together. Again, the ancient agora and the cemetery of Keramikos, the hill of Philopapos, Acropolis, and the northern part of the city, the industrial triangle of Kleanthis and Schaubert. The objectives of the project. The unification program aims at restoring the historic continuity of the city and creating poles of attraction for the Athenians, while ensuring at the same time a better quality of life within an environmentally, functionally and culturally upgraded physical space. A space which will principally project the historic physiognomy of Athens through harmonic coexistence of elements associated with both cultural heritage and present-day development. In this framework, the more specific objectives of the program may be the following. First, the organization and upgrading of the archaeological sites themselves. Second, the creation of a pedestrian network which connects the archaeological zones and recreates in part ancient pedestrian movements. Third, the creation of green areas and open spaces which will run through the entire area. Fourth, the rehabilitation and conservation of monuments and renovation and upgrading of buildings, facades, removal of advertisements, signs, and so on. Fifth, the enactment of planning legislation and formulation of architectural regulations which are specific to the area. Sixth, the reduction of building density in areas which influence the character of the unified zones, and this is not an easy task. Seventh, the application of transport and traffic regulations and creation of parking facilities in correspondence with the mass transport system, and those of you who visited Athens recently know what I'm talking about. The establishment of a fixed rail light tram which will service the main pedestrian corridors. And last, the expansion of the natural gas distribution network into the area for the purpose of reducing air pollution. Now, some description of the program itself. The company's program includes small and large-scale actions in the 6 areas composing the unified archaeological space. The space which will be the result of the integration of the ancient and modern city. These are the 6 areas shown in this map. First, Metaxurgion, Psyri, and the Academy of Plato. Well, the numbers are different, but anyway. Secondly, Keramikos Cemetery and the Sacred Road to Elefsis. Thirdly, Philopapos Hill and Acropolis. Fourth, the Commercial Triangle. Fifth or sixth, I must have missed one, the area and around the Marble Stadium. These areas composing the unified archaeological space incorporate 6 of the most important sites, archaeological sites of Greece. The Keramikos, the ancient, which is this area here, Keramikos Cemetery, the ancient Agora, which is the background. Up here is the hill of the Acropolis. The Roman Forum, further in the back, the Acropolis Hill, the Philopapos Hill, and the Olympian Zeus Temple. And these particular archaeological sites were the subject of 6 separate architectural studies which have already been assigned. So we already have 6 projects going on, introducing proposals for the improvement of these 6 sites and trying to give back to the monuments their initial form when possible, while they recreate in part ancient pedestrian movements. At the same time, they make proposals for the surroundings of the sites and give an emphasis to the interrelationships between the sites and the everyday life of the city. These are some of the projects. This particular one around the Roman library. This is the Roman library. These are again floor plans, master plans of one of these 6 studies. This particular one is for Keramikos. This is for the area of the Olympian temple, the Olympian Zeus temple. This is the temple. And again, the previous one was the existing situation, and this one is a proposal to restore the river going through, the bed of the river, and the sites unified by green. The building facades around each archaeological site will be studied and proposals will be made in order to incorporate them to the overall concept. Renovations, new applications and/or alterations will be proposed depending on each building's or district's characteristics, such as scale, style, color, etc. In addition to antiquities, neoclassical landmarks will be renovated, and not only neoclassical, but all important buildings. Old excavations will be unearthed, providing important findings and enriching the sites with more vistas and points of interest. More excavations will be specifically planned for the future, adding to the significance and continuity of the archaeological landscape. Information will be provided abundantly in the form of elegant signs and panels placed in specific points of interest. These 6 very important projects, and this is another view of the previous one, proposing some light structures for information and cultural purposes, will act as the backbone of the park's central zone, the zone concerning Dionysio Areopagitou and the Apostle Paul streets. This is an axis separating the Acropolis Hill from the Philopappou, the extension of the old street of Tripodon, which was a memorial way to the theatre of Dionysos. The hills to the south, and with the brief description of this project I will conclude. The hills to the south, Arios Pagos, Pnyx, the hill of the nymphs, Philopappos, were hardly included in the first plans for Athens. As you remember, the city was developed in the north of Acropolis. They formed a natural historic background for the monuments of the Acropolis that were, as we have already mentioned, to remain free of use for future excavation. By 1864, the digs along the south slope of the Acropolis had already yielded outstanding finds, such as the theatre of Dionysos and the Odeon of Herodes Attikos. Following these discoveries, a boulevard was created, running alongside the south slope and joining the Olympion with the Theseion area. This is the Theseion area, and this is the Olympion, the area of the temple of Olympian Zeus. And this is the boulevard which was created in the past. Unfortunately, however, this idyllic countryside promenade was to become the major traffic artery of Dionysio Areopagitou and Apostolou Pavlou in our era, cutting ruthlessly through the historic landscape. What was initially intended as a unifying element became the major cause of disruption. This boulevard is now filled with buses, private vehicles, and a lot of pollution, causing, as Mr. Zambas mentioned yesterday, great degree of destruction to the marbles. By 1950, excavations in the broader area of the Acropolis had completely changed the picture, and the need to incorporate the excavated areas in the town's living tissue became imperative. It is this same goal that half a century later we seek to achieve today. Meanwhile, the boom of tourism, building activity and traffic have made the problem even more difficult to deal with. The area under consideration is vast and consists of major archaeological sites and monuments, green belts and urban zones, all intricately related. This is again the axis we are talking about. The aim is to redesign the main artery running through the cultural historic zone, namely starting from the Olympion, Dionysiou Arapagitou and Apostle Paul streets, up to Ermou and Keramikos. And this is a plan throughout the length of this project. This artery will be transformed into a pedestrian walkway, or we might even say into Europe's most interesting and historic pedestrian zone. Sounds a bit ambitious. An adequate open space which will be much more than a biological necessity for walk and recreation. It will be a true experience through the ages. The walkway will accommodate all major archaeological sites, the new Acropolis Museum that will be erected at the Makrigiani plot, green areas such as the Philopapos Hill, and recreational districts such as the Theseion district, which is up north. It should also provide access to a minibus that will probably be replaced in the future by a tram. This was proposed by late Antonis Stritsis, the mayor of Athens, and will form part of a ring route serving the center of the city. The overall design and the materials proposed aim at a discreet and gentle yet modern intervention. The main concern is to embrace all interventions into one integral entity and to provide a subtle yet highly sophisticated background for the Athenian monuments, topmost of which is the landscape itself. Thank you very much.
We would like to thank Mr. Trepodakis for his presentation. The programs sound extremely ambitious for the center of Athens and ambiguous in some way. It is important, in fact, to see the way that we can discuss a city like Athens and order in a city like Athens. But good luck with it. Okay, we're going on with Christopher Young. Dr. Young comes from the north of England, as it were. His topic of today is the Hadrian's Wall. We go out, as it were, of the city and we come into the landscape and to see the way that, in fact, inventions like walls that confine, as it were, the Roman Empire can decisively shape landscapes in the north of England. Dr. Young is an archaeologist who has been working for the Department of the Environment and English Heritage. Since 1995, he has been the director for Hadrian's Wall for English Heritage, responsible for the completion of the management plan of 1999